Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Israel's democracy. Israel, like the United States, is a strong democracy. But not all democracies are the same. And that's important to see as we compare the United States and Israel. The United States is a republic and a representative democracy. Israel is a parliamentary democracy, akin to many of Europe's democratic nations. Israel's parliament is modeled on the ancient Jewish court that functioned from the late biblical period through the beginning of the rabbinic period, which actually begins in the year 70 CE of the Common Era. Like that court, it is called the Knesset. It was called the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, and has 120 seats or members. For a government to succeed in the parliamentary democracy, there must be a show of confidence in the government. The best way to obtain that in Israel is to have at least 50% of the members of Knesset, that is 60 of the 120, pledge their support for the leader chosen by the party that garnered the most Knesset seats in the election. That translates into 60 seats. And when that is achieved, a coalition is formed. When and if there are less than 60 votes supporting the leader, the prime minister and the government falls. Over these past few weeks, the world has been witness to Israeli democracy at play. The ups and downs, the ins and outs, the drama, the intrigue, the stitching together of a government, the final hurrah of Israel's longest-serving prime minister after failing to form a coalition, and the emergence of one of the most unlikely coalitions ever to be imagined since the birth of the Jewish state 73 years ago. Over the past 2 years, Israel has gone to the polls 4 times, and not once was the sitting prime minister able to garner the necessary votes from members of other parties, and so they went time and time again back to the old drawing board, and in this case that means the voting booths. The ousted prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who everyone calls Bibi, the man who served the country as prime minister for the past 12 years, from 2009 to 2021, and for 3 years before that, from 1996 to 1999, was quite frankly a rather divisive figure. Extremely gifted and talented, most certainly, but not that easy to get along with. Most Americans who love Israel loved Bibi. He was the perfect face for the country they love. Standing tall and strong, with dramatic-looking scar on his lip, his English is native, and his use of idiom and metaphor are well-placed and on target. But that sentiment is not shared by all Israelis. Only half of Israelis like Bibi. The other half despise him. Bibi's biggest weakness was his inability to groom a successor. Of the people who brought Netanyahu down, 3 of the leaders of the parties who joined against him, of the 8 that joined against him, and successfully formed a new ruling coalition, the 36th government of Israel, 3 of them were his one-time protégés. That group includes Naftali Bennett, Israel's newest prime minister, Avigdor Lieberman, the head of the party called Yisrael Beitenu, and Gideon Sa'ar, the head of the New Hope party. He saw their genius and their talent. He taught them and nurtured that talent, and then he destroyed those relationships and forced them away. But before casting them off, Netanyahu taught them well, and they each rose to great heights. They created alternatives to Netanyahu's government, and today they are reaping the rewards and casting Netanyahu aside. The unspoken truth about Bibi Netanyahu is that he destroys his protégés and pushes his closest friends far away. Israel's new prime minister, Naftali Bennett, is a tech millionaire. The child of American Jews who moved to Israel, Bennett left tech startups in New York after bringing several to sale at great profit. In Israel, he chose to become politically involved and moved into position as chief of staff for Netanyahu. According to pretty reliable rumors, after a contentious conflict with the First Lady, Bennett split off and became the formidable politician who ousted his mentor. The process that defeated the master was the creation of a coalition of disparate groups from Israel's entire political spectrum, from the right and from the left. And for the first time in Israeli history, an Arab party is part of the governing coalition. These parties have nothing in common except for their disdain for Bibi. Many Israelis are saddened and many are relieved that a very new government is in place. Many Israelis are hopeful that this new chapter in Israeli politics will herald a new era and break the deadlock that has engulfed Israel for such a long time. Prime Minister Bennett is to the political right of former Prime Minister Netanyahu. You get that? He's more right-wing than Netanyahu. He makes no bones about it, and the name of his party the party he's created is actually called Yamina, which means right in Hebrew. That was not an arbitrary choice of a party name. Bennett was saying when he created the name, we are the authentic right. Bibi is a politician and his Likud party does not represent the true right. Of the Arabs in the coalition, some are Islamists. Other members of the coalition are centrist and leftist, socialist, and even communists. There is more that separates these coalition members than joins them. Bennett, for example, is a strong believer in settlements, while many of his coalition partners are totally opposed to settlements. And while, in general, Israelis are jaded, they're also very direct and honest. They are, by necessity, a very practical people. And yet, one of the most overarching characteristics of Israelis is their optimism. They plan for the future. They love the future. They created a state in the shadow of the Holocaust in order to build a future. They are surrounded by enemies who for decades were bent on their destruction, yet they are future-oriented. Israelis have a romantic optimism about the future, and that is one of the reasons they ousted Netanyahu. After 12 or 15 years, depending on how you count, the feeling in Israel was that it was time for change. The looming question is whether the change they got will have its own future, or will it crumble and collapse when the first inevitable crisis emerges within that coalition and government. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column from the New York Times. It's authored by the famous Thomas L. Friedman, and it's entitled, Bibi is Trump and the Israeli Change Coalition is Biden. It appeared online on June 3rd, 2021. This column offers a pretty accurate analysis of Israel, and it paints a pretty accurate picture of Netanyahu. Friedman begins by laying out the similarities between Bibi and Trump. This is how he starts. To understand the political drama playing out in Israel and the tentative formation of a national unity coalition to topple Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, you don't need to speak Hebrew. You need to understand only one thing. Netanyahu makes his enemies even angrier than Donald Trump does. Friedman continues in the analysis comparing Trump to Netanyahu, and he focuses on several important examples of how they are similar. He continues, just like Trump, Netanyahu's main political strategy for winning elections has been to foster an intense personality cult and to try to gain and hold power with slim majorities by dividing Israel along as many lines as possible. In his case, primarily Jews versus Arabs, left versus right, religious versus secular, and patriots versus traitors. And just like Trump, Bibi did not stop at red lights. He was perfectly happy to undermine Israel's democratic institutions, the press, and the rule of law. Anything that could restrain his quest to retain power after 12 years in office. That explains why today he is struggling to stay alive politically. At the same time, his future is tied up with investigations and legal proceedings over bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Sound familiar? Now Tom Friedman changes gears and focuses on Yair Lapid, the other major leader in the new coalition. Friedman writes, a few weeks ago, when Israel's president granted Lapid a chance to try to form a government, Lapid declared that we've had enough of anger and of hate, and that his goal was to start something different. Well, Lapid and his right-wing and left-wing coalition allies are certainly on track to doing that. So intense is the desire of the anti-Bibi coalition to oust him that it is breaking the biggest political taboo in Israeli political history, being willing to serve in a national unity coalition with an Israeli Arab Islamist party whose 4 seats in parliament were essential to produce this new ruling majority. Tom Friedman now addresses the addition of the Israeli Arab Party to the governing coalition. He writes, and he writes it very well, and he's trying to explain why it's so unique and why it's so different, and why ultimately it's significant. He writes, as Israeli media has noted, Mansour Abbas, the leader of the Israeli Arab Ra'am Party, known as the United Arab List in English, made Israeli political history Wednesday by signing an agreement that will for the first time see an Arab party join a government. He told reporters that he, Lapid and Bennett reached a critical mass of agreements in various areas that serve the interest of the Arab society. This is amazing. Abbas's view is that it is high time for Israeli Arabs to play the game of Israeli politics the same way the other big non-Zionist political bloc in Israel, the Jewish ultra-Orthodox parties, plays that game. And it plays by using its swing votes to extract as many budgetary resources as possible for its community. Ynet reported that Bennett and Lapid promised Ram significant new money to tackle the rampant violence and organized crime in Arab society, and to repair crumbling infrastructure in Arab towns and villages. Over the next 10 years, reality check. One thing I have learned from 4 decades of reporting about Middle East is that the 8 most dangerous words to ever put into a news story or column after some big event are, the world will never be the same again. As Friedman concludes, he tells us that he is not really hopeful about real change. He writes, I wish I could say that having stared into the abyss, I am certain that the forces of decency in both societies, on both the left and the right, are now backing away, and that Bidenism and Lapidism are the future. Yes, I wish that I could say that, but I can't. Next up is a column by Dory Gold, and it was printed in Ynet on June 13, 2021. The column is entitled, The Baseless Charge That Israel is an Apartheid State. Again, Gold was Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, a close associate of Bibi. He was Netanyahu's appointee, actually. He serves currently as the president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. He was Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. Gold begins by addressing the column's central theme, Israel and apartheid. He writes, the baseless accusations that Israel has adopted an apartheid system similar to South Africa's pre-1994 racial doctrine just won't go away. Recently, Ilan Baruch and Dr. Alon Liel, 2 former Israeli diplomats who served as Israel's envoys in South Africa, have written in the South African internet periodical Daily Maverick that Israel took inspiration from apartheid regimes. In doing so, Baruch and Liel chose to ignore the legal and historical facts which contradict this inflammatory and misguided accusation, as well as the professional judgments of some of the leading experts in the field of human rights law. For example, 10 years ago, Justice Richard J. Goldstone, who served on South Africa's Constitutional Court, wrote very plainly in the New York Times on October 31st, 2011, that descriptions of Israel as an apartheid state are unfair and inaccurate slander. Goldstone, by the way, is not a fan of Israel, but he recognized that it was not an apartheid regime. Dory Gold then quotes from others who attest to the fact that Israel is not an apartheid state. And he asks the burning question once again, why does the charge stick, even though it's not correct? Dory Gold writes, the question now is, if it's so clear that Israel is not an apartheid state, why do writers persist to argue to the contrary? Israel's adversaries are waging an ideological war against the Jewish state. They understand that Israel is the only country whose legitimacy was recognized by both the United Nations and the League of Nations. Advocates of the Israel apartheid libel hope that their campaign will lead to Israel's delegitimization and eventual replacement with a Palestinian Islamic entity. This campaign against Israel has had vile after effects. That needs to be noted. It is no coincidence that the world is witnessing an upsurge of anti-Semitism. Anti-Israel demonstrations today frequently have signs that refer to apartheid. Those pushing the Israel is an apartheid state rhetoric are playing with fire. Ideological concludes, we have been working to build a new network of ties with Arab states from Sudan to the United Arab Emirates. We have reopened our relations with sub-Saharan Africa and have been welcomed by Guinea and Chad. Israel's future lies in the normalization of relations with our neighbors, not acquiescing to hate-filled rhetoric of its opponents. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 6 cartoons today. First up is a simple statement. It's hilarious. It reads, common sense is so rare these days, it should be classified as a superpower. Next up is a cartoon. Bibi is before the World Court, and there is a list of criminal charges against him and against Israel. Bibi points to a Hamas rocket, and the judges say, it does not work anymore. The cartoonist is essentially pointing out how truly shocking it is that the truth has nothing to do with how Israel is perceived. Israel is just judged and condemned. That is a dangerous situation. Next up is a funny depiction of Bibi sitting on a ship, and the ship is sinking. The name of the ship is Era of Netanyahu. It is true, for the moment, Bibi, occupying the position of head of opposition, he is planning on bringing down the new coalition. Maybe, maybe not. Only time will tell. This next cartoon depicts Bibi in 3 frames, during 3 periods in his recent political career. In the first frame, he is holding a piece of paper which reads corruption charges, and he says witch hunt. Frame 2, the election loss, he says fake news. The third frame reads new government formed, Bibi out. He says, I'll be back. This next cartoon is Bibi looking up at Bennett, who is draped in an Israeli flag that reads Coalition for Israeli Unity Government. Bennett looks like a giant. From the other side, you see just how difficult it is for Bennett to stand on the shoulders of his coalition. This is very true. It is very difficult to keep that coalition together. There's no doubt about it. Finally, this cartoon is about the June 21st Iranian presidential election. Only 7 people were given permission to run by the official Guardian Council. This is hardly an election. As always, the Grand Ayatollah will probably select the winner, not the people. He is the puppeteer, and that is made perfectly clear in this cartoon. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Egypt has pledged $500 million to help repair and rebuild Gaza. The Egyptian army tractors and other equipment have already crossed the border between Gaza and Egypt. Accompanying the equipment were soldiers. Army engineers crossed the border also, alongside the equipment. The Egyptian officers and soldiers are in Gaza for the first time since 1967. They are there to help rebuild Gaza, and they are there to monitor where Egypt's money is going. And very importantly, the Egyptian soldiers and officers are in Gaza to make certain that Hamas does not once again shoot rockets into Israel. Not everyone is pleased with Egypt's military in Gaza. Palestinians fear that it is an Egyptian move to invade or at least to take over Gaza. And Israel has asked Egypt to remove their equipment. Israel too is fearful about Egypt trying to play too large a role in Gaza. If all Egypt wants to do is rein in Hamas, that's a good deal. But is that all really that they want? Is it worth the risk of permitting Egypt into Gaza? I don't know. Jaffa, which is part of Tel Aviv, is what Israelis call a mixed city. That means that in this city, in Jaffa, Jews and Arabs live together. 100% of the Arabs of Jaffa are 100% citizens of Israel. Over the past few weeks, mixed cities in Israel have been seen tremendous violence. Eruptions of violence between Jews and Arabs. Most of the violence, though not all, has been between Arabs attacking Jews. In the Ajami neighborhood in Jaffa is one example. 3 young Arab men threw a Molotov cocktail into a home. They thought incorrectly that the home was inhabited by Jews. The attack landed, and a 12-year-old Arab boy was hospitalized, severely injured with terrible burns. The police have arrested the 3 young men. Investigators say that the accused were acting in retaliation for violence which has taken place in Lud, another mixed city, and on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The 3 were also upset that Arabs were evicted from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah, a neighborhood in Jerusalem. After their arrest, additional weapons, not just materials for Molotov cocktails, were discovered in the homes of the 3 young men. That is a scary reality. For the first time in the history of modern Israel, the Prime Minister of Israel will wear a kippah and is Shomer Shabbat, Sabbath observant. He's a Jew that observes kashrut and halacha. Although Menachem Begin was Shomer Shabbat and often wore a kippah, he was known for donning it and then removing it as his head covering. So why is Naftali Bennett, that new prime minister wearing a kippah, attacked by the Haredi religious community? Why is he being called the evil one and the destroyer of Judaism in Israel? A traitor to Judaism. That's what he's being called by other Jews. The answer has nothing to do with Judaism or tradition, and everything to do with budget. Haredi parties, by their own choice, are no longer in the government. And when you are no longer in the government, you no longer have power. And that means that your special interests will no longer receive special attention, and more importantly, special budgets. The Haredi community will take a significant budget hit with this new government. Established educational institutions and schools will of course receive allocations, but almost no schools in the Haredi community conform to national standards, and they will now suffer the consequences unless they raise their standards to national standards. Not only will Haredi education suffer, Haredi housing projects will also fall to low priority as an issue within the new government. For decades, Haredi leadership has perfected the art of joining and supporting the government, and in exchange, they received essential money for schools and housing. The Haredi community will not be left high and dry. Not all the benefits that they have received will disappear, but certainly a significant percentage of the money that have been allocated will dry up with this new government. The times, they are a-changing. There continue to be ripples from the attempted overthrow, the coup of King of Jordan several months ago. At the time, Prince Hamza, a stepbrother of the current king, was placed under house arrest and charged with attempting to topple the king. Now, the former head of the royal court, Bassam Awadallah, is standing trial. Also standing trial is a former finance minister, Sharif Hassan Zaid, a distant relative of the king, who played a significant role in trying to liberalize Jordan's economy. The 2 were arrested in early April when the former heir to the throne, Prince Hamza, was placed under house arrest over allegations that he had liaisoned with foreign parties over a plot to destabilize Jordan, a close U.S. ally in the Middle East. Reuters and the Washington Post reported that Russia is about to provide Iran with advanced technology, including satellites, that would propel Iranian defense forces tremendously forward from where they are today. The Russian satellite system is called the Canopus 5. It has a highly sophisticated camera with extra high resolution. Technology of this sort would allow Iran to track numerous military targets at a single moment, all across the Middle East. The satellite would provide Iran with an ongoing monitoring of oil fields, troop movements. It will also allow Iran to see military barracks in Israel and every U.S. troop movement in the entire Middle East. The plan is to launch the Iranian-Russian satellite from Russia itself in a few months. At least that's according to the coverage. If Iran were to receive this technology, it would most definitely change the face of the Middle East and would help Iran become an even greater power in the region. Russian President Vladimir Putin, however, addressed this very news story in an interview on NBC News and said that it's just nonsense, garbage. Putin said that the entire idea was contrived. It's just fake news. At the very least, I don't know anything about this kind of thing. That's what he said. Maybe, but the problem with Putin is that he himself is not reliable. There is nothing Putin says that can be taken at face value. Nothing that can be assumed to be accurate or true when Putin is telling us. Putin does not want to be caught helping Iran defend itself. But that sounds exactly like what Russia is doing. Not wanting to be caught doing something does not mean not wanting to do something. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Israel is always at a crossroads. It's just the reality of this historic, spectacular country. In Israel, history is always being made. That's also a reality. I cannot tell you what will happen in the future because I'm not a prophet. I can tell you that the people who are in the current government will need some time to learn. But it's a very steep learning curve. A very steep learning curve. But the stopwatch is ticking. Obviously, his strongest supporters are very upset that Bibi is out. But others really want to see fresh blood and new people and new ideas running the country of Israel. One thing you must know is that, without a question, those now in charge of Israel love Israel and will do their best to protect the country and the people they love and are charged to care for. They will work hard to heal internal wounds and hopefully they will succeed. If they fail, they will be voted out. The margin is so narrow in the Knesset that they could fail at any moment. And in a parliamentary democracy, that means ending and being kicked out immediately, not waiting for a new election. Then Israelis will return to the polls for a fifth election if that happens. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.